Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, July 24th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the Week 1 questions that I have. We're only a month out from football happening, so we'll get to Week 0 and Week 1 questions, mainly Week 1, but definitely a little bit of Week 0 in there, because that's what I'm counting down to. I don't know about y'all, but then we'll talk about the 12-team playoff and how I tend to believe it's just going to be a little blip in college football history. Definitely something that I don't expect to see after the 2025 season, and I'll kind of get into details and break down why I don't expect to see it and what could kind of be the different path forward. Then we'll get into SMU. They have definitely been a little bit under the radar this offseason, have made their way into the ACC, and I feel like they're going to be at the top of college football for quite some time. I'll break down exactly what I mean by that a little bit down the road. Then we'll get into the top contenders. We'll talk about where their season is going to be decided. You always circle that 3 to 4 game stretch where you really became a championship contender. I'll break that down for the top 4 teams in the country going into this season. Then we'll do the hot takes for contenders. We'll continue that segment, get into the ACC today, a ton to break down in that conference. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. We get to kind of have a fun back and forth here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. So if you'd like to use that, again, that is gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about all of the questions I have in Week 1 of college football. We are a month out from Week 0 kicking off, but that's what I'm counting down to anyways. We will definitely have one Week 0 question in here, but most of them will revolve around Week 1 because there's a lot of questions that will be answered on that day, and definitely a lot that we'll have to unpack after those games because there's a lot of big-time games and definitely a lot to learn about the teams in those games. So let's start this off, and the biggest thing that I'm learning, or I want to learn from the Week 1 games is, where are Riley Leonard and Connor Wegman at? Obviously, both of them had some injury troubles from a year ago, and both are coming in with a ton of hype going into this year. Riley Leonard wants to lead his team to a national title, and it's absolutely something that is in grasp for Notre Dame. On the other side, Connor Wegman has every ability to be a top pick in the NFL draft if he can put together a really good season this upcoming year because the tools are just absolutely off the charts for this kid. So I think both of them are coming in with a ton of hype, and they get to meet in Week 1, and it's going to be very, very interesting to kind of watch them go about their business because neither of these defenses are going to be easy to play against. I think A&M's is going to be a little bit easier, a little bit worse than Notre Dame's, but not by a lot, by any means. The Notre Dame one will be very interesting because you have guys on that back end like Benjamin Morrison, like Xavier Watts, that Connor Wegman's going to have to deal with, and they're very veteran guys that know how to take advantage of someone that maybe hasn't played too much football. So there's definitely a little bit of worry there, but if he can come out and absolutely sling the ball around, then I think we're talking about Connor Wegman in a totally different light coming out of that game. And as we move into Week 2 and into the SEC schedule especially, you're looking at A&M not only as a team that could, mess something up for one of the big boys, but could absolutely make some noise themselves and possibly even make it to an SEC championship game. So I think this is one of those games that I tend to believe it's the most interesting, the most fun, and the best game of Week 1, and I think it's largely because of these two quarterbacks. We're going to learn so much about these two guys that we didn't get to see near enough of from a year ago, and definitely want to see what they look like going into this year, particularly Riley Leonard, because he's been out for quite some time, and we'll learn a lot about those two guys, and whoever comes out on top is definitely off running for the 2024 season. So really excited to see what those guys have in store for us. But the other thing I kind of want to unpack here is, who are the guys on offense for Clemson? And this is kind of going to be a little bit harder to find an answer to in Week 1 because of how good UGA is likely going to be on the defensive side of the ball, particularly in that back end with Malachi Starks. And I think Dalen Everett is going to be one of the big-time breakout players in college football this year. But overall, we got to find someone, right? Cade Klubnik has to be able to find a couple of big-time players on that offense to get the ball to time and again. What's up, Anthony? Nice to see you. We have Tyler Brown as the guy that I'm circling, definitely the guy that I tend to believe is going to be the dude at wide receiver, at least early on in the season. I think he will be the go-to guy. And then you have Bryant Wesco, a really, really talented freshman that came in, someone that absolutely has a ton of hype, and I'll talk about him a little bit later in the show as well. But Adam Randall is someone else that I think could absolutely make some plays. They have Jake Burningstool at tight end, so there are plenty of guys. There's no two ways about that, but someone's got to show themselves, or at least a couple of guys have to show themselves as being legitimate options in that week 1 game. I'm not necessarily expecting anyone to go for 200 yards and tear up a Georgia defense, but at least show that you can, make the plays that Cade Klubnik needs you to make. And if they get totally bottled up and no one can make a play on the outside, maybe it's one of those seasons again for Clemson. But it'll be interesting to watch that because we might not get a straight answer just because of how good that defense is going to be for UGA this upcoming year. And then let's get into Miami. Wait, we got a question here from Anthony. Yeah, I mean, personally, I believe the wide receiver position is the biggest difference between the Clemson that was dominating college football and the Clemson now. And I think Bryant Wesco and TJ Moore coming in as freshmen are kind of that old crop of wide receivers, kind of getting back to what they used to have. So I think they're kind of getting right on the right path, but if those guys don't show up big this season, then we could still have that problem in Clemson, and I don't really know how long they have to fix it. So it'll be really interesting to watch that kind of unfold this season, but it feels like they're starting to figure that out. But let's get into Miami and talk about the 2024 season because we're going to learn if Miami's ready to take that next step. I understand that this game is going to be blown out of proportion quite a bit. Whoever loses this game is, the sky is falling for them. Whoever wins it is coming out with as much momentum as really anyone coming out of week 1. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a huge game for Miami. They're walking into a really hostile environment in the swamp. They're walking in with a ton of new guys that have to meld pretty quickly, including Cam Ward, their starting quarterback. So I think they have to be ready to roll, and if they can walk into the swamp and get a win, I really don't care how they do it, because frankly, this is going to be a close game. I can really not find any reason to think it's not going to be close. I think it's going to be an absolute battle, and it's going to be one of those games that you look up in the fourth quarter and maybe you have a 7-point game, but then Miami's got to make winning plays. And frankly, that was what was missing from last year's team, and that's for a myriad of reasons, including some of the coaching miscues that happened throughout the season. But overall, Miami's got to hit the ground running, and we're going to figure out if they're able to take that next step because no matter what Florida team you're playing, and this is still a pretty good Florida team, although the record might not show it at the end of the year, if you can walk into the swamp and get a big-time win, then you're ready to roll and you can play with pretty much anyone in the country, especially anyone in the ACC. So I think this would at least give us an idea of who Miami is and definitely give us an idea of can they walk into these hostile environments and keep their composure and make those winning plays that just kind of eluded them a year ago. But we also have Texas. I think it's very interesting because this is a very under-the-radar game, a game that not a lot of people are thinking about. Texas is playing Colorado State. Texas should likely win by 14, 21, 28 points, whatever have you. But at the end of the day, I think there's going to be a ton of answers from this game, and I think the biggest thing here is Colorado State loves to throw the ball around. That's what they do. Braden Fowler Nicolosi is very, very comfortable in this offense, and they push the ball around the field. That plays into exactly what Texas really struggled with a year ago. They could not get to the quarterback in the pass rush, and their secondary was not very strong down the stretch. Definitely got beat deep just way too many times, and we'll be able to see if they can handle that this upcoming year, if they've taken real concrete steps to kind of fix that problem. So both places are much better than they were a year ago. You add a guy like Trey Moore to the pass rushing unit that has Colin Simmons coming in as well, a very talented freshman, Barron Sorrell, Ethan Burke. There's going to be plenty of guys that can rush the passer, so I think there'll be okay there, but at the end of the day, it was something that they were talking about, I believe, on Texas Football, where they were saying they got to get at least 3 sacks on this. They got to get 3 sacks in this game, and they have to have at least somewhat of a stifling pass defense if I'm going to feel confident about this Texas defense going into this year. So I think that's the biggest thing. It's not necessarily going to be a game where you learn everything about Texas defense, but there's definitely a couple of things that Colorado State likes to do that plays into some of the things Texas struggled to do a year ago, and we'll figure out if those are fixed issues or if they're going to carry into 2024. Definitely will be a very, very interesting thing. And then, yeah, definitely Anthony brings up a great point. Once you start SEC play, it's a totally different game, but we'll at least learn a little bit about what those two units have in store for Texas this upcoming season. And then you have a ton of other stuff to kind of break down going into week one. He had a question here, excuse me. I think it's one of those things. If Miami goes in and beats Florida, I think it would be a huge win for the program and absolutely catapult them. At the end of the day, what happens in the ACC is really going to be the end-all, be-all. And for Florida, it might hold more weight, if I'm being totally honest with you, this game, because you have to start the season strong because the back end of this schedule is an absolute nightmare. So it could be that Billy Napier, if he loses this game, is in trouble the entire rest of the year because, frankly, it's really hard to find 6 wins right now. So if Miami is a loss as well, then you're going to have a ton of trouble going into the back end of this year. So it could be that is the end-all, be-all for him, that it starts, the end of his career at Florida. But it could be the kickstart of a really good year and keep him in town because I think he's a really good coach. I just think that's a program that had a lot to fix when he showed up. But it'll be really interesting to watch. That's obviously one of the big-time talking points going into this year. But let's continue on here and talk about Penn State because I think we're going to learn a little bit about them offensively. The thing about this one is Penn State and West Virginia played a year ago, and Drew Aller was incredible. He was absolutely awesome, and he was awesome in a lot of games that weren't Michigan and Ohio State. And that's obviously the big-time step that he has to take this year is show up in those big-time games. So maybe we won't exactly learn, has Drew Aller taken that next step, but we will see what this offense looks like under Andy Kotelnicki, the new offensive coordinator, and we'll see if it has a bigger ceiling. I think there was some parts of that game where, yes, the offense was moving and they were doing what they wanted to do, but it wasn't necessarily quite as clean as you wanted it to be at times. And I think one of the biggest things for Penn State is just keep everything moving. And then West Virginia on the other side is definitely going to be a better defense this time around. So I think it'll be really interesting to watch this. But overall, this could be the same old Penn State. This could be a team that is, fully capable of dominating a team like West Virginia. But then when Ohio State rolls into town, you got a whole other problem. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch all of that. But we really won't get a firm answer about this offense until they get into Big Ten play, and especially until they play Ohio State, because that's where, the real difference between old Penn State and hopefully the new Penn State is really going to be made. And yeah, absolutely, James Franklin does have kind of the same problem that Mario Cristobal has had with some of the clock management issues down the stretch, and it's cost him games, especially in those big-time games that have kept him from taking that next step. But let's get into Florida State here, and let's talk about the offense in particular, but overall this team, how fast can they meld? Because they really kick off the season with 2 games that they're not necessarily overly scary on paper, but they're dangerous games. You play Georgia Tech in Ireland, which is a game that there's just so many variables. You never really know what can happen in that game. I tend to believe it's going to be close one way or the other. And then you have Boston College on Monday night in Tallahassee. So it's going to be really interesting to watch, but they got to get rolling pretty quickly, especially on the offensive side of the ball. They definitely need to get things rolling because Georgia Tech's going to score points. I can almost promise you that. Even against this really good defense, I think they're going to be able to move the ball down the field and definitely score some points. And if you don't come ready to return that, then you could have a problem on your hands. So I don't necessarily think they're in danger of losing these games outright, but let's say they walk into that Ireland game and win 24-21, and then they beat Boston College by 4 points, by 7 points. I wouldn't feel great going into the rest of the season. Obviously, you get 2 big conference wins to start the year, but you definitely don't, inspire a lot of confidence among your fan base going into this year, and you have a lot of bigger games down the stretch that will cause problems if, those first 2 cause problems for you. So I think we'll learn at least a little bit about where DJ's at, where these wide receivers at, where Roy Dell Williams is at, and we'll at the very least get to see, how far this team has come in pretty short amount of time putting together a whole team. Yeah, I think that's one of the things, Anthony. It kind of is the ultimate equalizer, going across seas, having those jet lag issues. Some of these guys haven't flown out of the U.S. before. Some of these guys haven't been on a plane. So it's going to be a very, very interesting thing and something that is going to be fascinating to unpack. But that doesn't even include some of the questions around the Colorado game, where is Colorado the team that we think they all are going to be, or is North Dakota State going to cause some problems? Can UGA start in absolutely dominating fashion and move towards a third title in 4 years? And is West Virginia a Big 12 contender? Because if they compete or maybe even beat Penn State, they definitely are. So it'll be absolutely awesome to watch those Week 1 games. They are getting closer and closer by the day, so cannot be more excited. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the 12-team playoff and how I tend to believe it's just a blip on the college football history book. So I'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits, I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the big Week 1 questions, and Anthony had one over here, and the two games that I tend to circle as possible contenders to be an upset the first week is a Week 0 game. Technically, I think that Georgia Tech-Florida State game is just a little bit sketchier than people are letting on, and with all of the different factors, I think that one could get interesting. And then North Dakota State playing Colorado is not going to be an easy one. I understand that Colorado should win, but at the end of the day, that is a hard-nosed team that knows how to play really good football, so it's going to be really interesting to watch that. I think West Virginia has a shot, but I wouldn't necessarily bet on it if I were you. But let's get into segment 2 here, and let's talk about the 12-team playoff, because right now it's 12 teams, a 5+7 format with 5 auto bids, 7 at-large bids, and that goes through 2025. We will have that for the next 2 years, but will we have it in 2026? I tend to believe no. I think there's not going to be a lot of push to keep this in place. I think it's going to be one of those things that we see for 2 years, and it's kind of just a blip in college football's history. So definitely will be a really interesting thing to kind of unpack as it kind of continues on, but yeah, I mean, Georgia absolutely could get upset if Clemson can come out absolutely cooking. I just tend to believe Carson Beck is going to be on too high of a level for that defense to be able to stop him Week 1. But will absolutely be really, really interesting to watch that game. But I think the playoff is one of those things where you get into it, and when you start talking about all of the different things that have gone into the expanded playoff, you have so many different entities fighting for so many different things and coming from pretty much every single direction. And you have about 10 different FBS commissioners and Notre Dame's athletic director that are a part of this kind of commission that has built up the college football playoff into what it is. They made it the 4-team, they've made it the 12-team, and likely in some time will make the 14 or 16-team playoff. So it'll be really interesting to watch all of this unfold. But the way I look at it when you go into this year is, I've said this before on this show, I believe, where I tend to believe this is maybe the most important selection Sunday in the history of the playoff, and maybe in the history of the sport, because when you look into what could happen on the other side of it, there are so many different ways this could go. Where, let's just say Ole Miss is 9-3 at the end of the season, and you have Kansas State at 10-2, and Kansas State gets in over Ole Miss. SEC people are going to be mad. There's no two ways about that. They are going to say that their conference is so much harder, that it's so much tougher, that 9-3 in their conference is way better than 10-2 in the Big 12. I wouldn't necessarily argue with that, but this is a reality that definitely could happen, and if it does, they're going to walk into that room with ESPN and with all the other people that, make decisions in this sport, and it's not going to go well for these smaller schools. I understand everyone is, represented here. They have all 10 FBS commissioners. Not all 10 have the same pull. That's just the reality, and in overarching, they don't have the same pull with ESPN, which is really the big-time crux here, where they're going to make the decision at the end of the day in a lot of ways. So it's going to be really, really interesting to kind of see this unfold and see, which interests overweigh others, and definitely see how this goes on Selection Sunday, because at the end of the day, the group of 5 commissioners are going to want to fight to have a seat at the table, but I would be surprised if the FBS schools or the big-time Power 4 schools didn't come back to the table saying we don't want auto bids anymore. It was something that was talked about at the SEC Media Days. I'm sure it's something that's being talked about at Big Ten Media Days right now is, we're all good with this auto bid system right now, but if we don't necessarily get the amount of teams that we expect to get in from the Big Ten or the SEC, we're not going to be as good about, the ACC getting in if you go 9-4 and just win a not so good conference. So I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation, and I think there's a reality where a 9-3 Bama misses out to a 10-2 Oklahoma State or a 10-2 Miami, and you have kind of a interesting conversation in those rooms where you don't obviously want to, totally kneel to the SEC and the Big Ten and give them as many teams as they want into this thing, but you also don't want to jeopardize the future of this playoff and the future especially of the group of 5 in the smaller conferences being able to be a part of it. So I think that's the biggest thing here is you're kind of fighting between a rock and a hard place. You're not necessarily in a position where you can allow all of the teams that, you expect to be in, like the big-time Big Ten and SEC teams. You can't just let all of those teams in and hope that everything is just going to work out perfectly. On the other side of things, you can't just, let everyone in based on how good their record is and expect them to not come in angry. So I think it's going to be kind of that battle back and forth, and we'll figure out on Selection Sunday how big of a deal it's going to be, because maybe there won't be that many people left out, but I tend to believe there's going to be at least one team that from the SEC and the Big Ten that feels they deserve to be in, that probably does deserve to be in, that will be left out. Whether that's Michigan or Penn State or Ole Miss or Bama or Texas or Georgia, I don't know. But at the end of the day, I think there's going to be someone that walks into that room where they're negotiating, I believe in January, and they'll have a decision by the end of 2025 on what the future is. They're going to walk into that room and demand some things. There's no two ways about that. And I think there's going to be a huge push to get rid of auto bids. I've said this on here before. I'm not an auto bid person. I don't think it's the right way to go about business, especially if you're trying to find a real national title winner. So I think that's one of the big things here. I would be in favor of taking away auto bids. Then you cause it a whole other problem where maybe the ACC and the Big 12 get one team in and the SEC and the Big 10 get everyone else in. So that creates kind of a different issue that definitely will be interesting to unpack, but you're kind of walking a tightrope if you're the conference or if you're the CFP committee this upcoming year, because you don't want to lean too far in the SEC and Big Ten's direction, but you also don't want to run the risk of them just taking their ball and going to play elsewhere, because they can do that. They absolutely have the pull at ESPN, at some of the big-time networks, where they can go off and make their own playoff and really not miss too much of a beat when it comes to media rights deals. Now, there would be a ton of hurdles to jump through. There's no two ways about that, but it's definitely something that absolutely could happen, and something that will be really, really interesting as it kind of comes forward. And one of the other things I kind of wanted to unpack real quick here is, in this playoff, you obviously have those first-round games, and it sounds like those first-round games aren't necessarily as cut and dry as we once thought. It felt like, it was going to be at the home stadium of the higher seed, and that was the end-all, be-all. But we heard the college football playoff chair speaking, I believe, at SEC Media Days. It could have been at another event, but he was talking about the college football playoff and those first-round games and how they'll go about, deciding who gets that first-round game. I thought it would just be the higher seed. It sounds like it's going to be, how many hotels do you have? How many facilities do you have? Do you have the ability to host everything that you need to host in that city? And that's just ridiculous. I'll just be totally honest. There's no world where any of this can happen not on college campuses. And I tend to believe that it'll end up happening wherever it needs to happen at the higher seeds college field. But at the end of the day, it's one of those things where you can't have a home college football playoff game and then be playing in your practice facility or be playing in a whole other state, which was an idea that was kicked around by Ohio State's athletic director, Gene Smith, but has come around to the idea of having it in the horseshoe. So this is going to be another really interesting thing to watch and could kind of impact these discussions down the road. But overall, the thing that I'm watching is, what happens if the SEC gets 5 teams in instead of getting 6, or they get 3 teams in instead of getting 4, and they have beef once they walk into that room in January? Because at the end of the day, they're going to have a lot of energy, and they're going to have a lot of power to kind of wield that, and it could lead to the end of the 12-team playoff. And I'm all for, having a playoff in general, and I'm all for having everyone have a seat at the table, but at the end of the day, you run a huge risk if you don't let an Ole Miss team in, or if you don't let an Alabama team in, or what have you at the end of the year, and then you run the risk of the SEC and the Big Ten meeting behind closed doors and saying, yeah, we're just going to have our own playoff. We're just going to play our own thing over here, and y'all worry about yourselves. We're just going to do our own thing and be able to handle all this, because that would really hurt every single other conference. So I think it's one of those things where it's going to be a really interesting selection Sunday, because there's going to be a lot of really angry teams. It just matters, where are those angry teams? Are they in the SEC? Are they in the Big Ten? Because that might dictate how long this 12-team playoff is in effect and how long we have to, deal with the auto bid system. All that different type of stuff is definitely going to be impacted by a couple hours on that Sunday. So it'll be really, really interesting to watch that. What's up, Hawaiian 5-0? Very good to see you. But definitely going to be really interesting to watch. But we will take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about SMU. There is a ton of stuff going on in Dallas, and there's a lot of juice around that program that I think a lot of people aren't seeing because it's just a little bit below the surface. But we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the 12-team playoff and how I tend to believe it's just going to be a little blip, a 2-year blip on the college football history books, and definitely will be very interesting to watch how that kind of unfolds, especially on Selection Sunday. But let's get into SMU and talk about how this is a very, very interesting program going into the next 10 years of college football, let's say. They came into the ACC this past year and definitely have a good team going into this year, can definitely make a lot of noise in 2024, but I think they're a team that you're going to have to worry about for quite some time, and there's a big time reason for that, and it's because they got a lot of money. You might just remember back in, well, you probably won't remember, but back in 1987, SMU got the worst punishment that any college football program has ever gotten. They got the death penalty, which essentially means you cannot operate as a program for 5 years. You can't do recruiting, you can't have visits, you can't practice, you can't do anything. And it essentially buried the program. For a very long time, SMU was just trying to make it by. They were trying to make the money that they needed to make. They were trying to be able to have an athletic department, and that was really the reality for quite some time. But now, 37 years down the road, they're in the ACC, and they're back at the table. And I think that's kind of a scary thought for some people out there, because the pockets are really deep. The thing that they got in trouble for back in 1987 and got them the worst penalty that I've ever seen, and one that, frankly, I don't think should ever be given out, but that's a total side point that we can get into later. I think it's one of those things that now you can pretty much do with free will. Now there's some ers and ahs in there that they probably can't do quite as readily at this time, but there's more wiggle room, and SMU just needed that little bit of wiggle room, and especially they needed just a seat at the table. So they got into the ACC, and one of the big things here is they got into the ACC for nothing. They didn't want any of the big time or any of the media rights deals for the next 10 years. So that's leaving about $270 million on the table just to get a seat at the table, which is obviously the big time trend we've seen in college football, whether it's coaches or players or teams or entire schools. Everyone's just trying to get to the Power 4 level because they see the writing on the wall. Everything is getting very, very sketchy in this game, and everything is leaning more and more towards the powers that be at the top, and it's going to cause the end of the group of five in a lot of different ways. So SMU got out in the nick of time. They had some trouble getting into the Big 12, but finally got into the ACC, and they left a lot of money on the table, but they've already raised a lot of money. They've raised about $125 million over the last little bit since they've gotten into the ACC, and that's going to fund them for about the next 5 years. And obviously there's some more bills that are going to come due that they'll absolutely have to deal with, but they have some donors that just have the deepest pockets that you could ever imagine. So I think there's going to be a lot of things to kind of unpack here, and this is not a school that's walking in that doesn't have history. This is a school that has 11 Southwest Conference championships with, teams like Texas and OU and all of these really, really tough teams in that conference back in the day. They have a Heisman winner in Doak Walker. You might just know the award for the best running back in the country. That's who it's named after. So this is a team, and then you have Eric Dickerson, who is one of the best running backs in the history of college football. He finished third in Heisman voting in 1982. So this is obviously a program that has history, that has plenty of market value, and that sits right in the center of a big-time city in Dallas. So I think this is one of those programs that the world is their oyster at this point. They definitely have a lot of ability to make some noise going into the ACC this year, and if they can do that, then a lot of things can happen for this team. I'm not necessarily saying they're going to jump up into the upper echelon of the Georgias and the Texas and the Bamas of the world, but they absolutely can make some plays and be a big-time player in this ACC conference for quite some time. And if the ACC were to fold, there's someone that's going to be coming to the door to pick up the ACC or pick up SMU. Obviously, it was tough to get in for the Big 10 or for the Big 12 last time, but Brett Yormark this time around, I don't think would miss that opportunity. I'll just leave it at that. But SMU has so many things going for it. They have the most wins of any Texas school in the Power 5 plus the AAC, which is kind of a Power 5 conference at this point if you were to add another one into that group. Over the last 4 seasons, they've had the most wins of any Texas team in that group of conferences. So obviously a really good program right now. 32% of the athletic budget goes towards football, which is right around where the ACC members do it. So that totally makes sense. They have the 8th highest ACC endowment, which is definitely a little bit lower, but I tend to believe is going to come up as this athletic department, as this program, and as the school kind of just gets a little bit bigger. And then they're top 6 nationally on coaches' salaries. So they can do pretty much anything that all of these big guys can do. Now, they obviously have a little bit of an uphill battle still to fight, even 37 years after all of that stuff went down with the death penalty and everything in between. But the reality is this is a very dangerous team, and if they can get their feet under them and especially get their financials in order, which is not necessarily too hard to do for SMU, they absolutely can be a player not only in the ACC, but in the entirety of college football. There is a lot of talent right in that city of Dallas where you can just go next door and play and go to some of these big-time schools that absolutely have tons of guys coming out that are going to play high-level football, and you don't have to grab all of them. Obviously, you got to compete against Texas and Texas A&M and OU on the recruiting trail because all of them are very close to Dallas, but at the end of the day, you're going to win some of those battles, and if you can start winning some more football games, you'll start winning more of those battles, and at the end of the day, they're one of those things, one of those programs where you wonder what would happen if 87 never happened, if they didn't get the death penalty, if they got, scholarship reductions and some of the penalties that we see today, if they got that back then. What is SMU now? Are they a SEC team that is right on par with Missouri and Kentucky and all of these other big time programs? Are they, one of the best programs in the country because they were back then? It's definitely one of those things that is one of the biggest what ifs in college football history. But at the end of the day, you can't really change the past. You can't deal with, what happened back then, and you wish you could, obviously, if you're an SMU fan. But at the end of the day, you're back at the table, and that's really all you needed. All you needed was a place to sit, and all you needed was a chance. And once they got it, it was going to be really scary, and I think we're seeing the start of that, and I don't know when it's going to end. I think there's going to be talent rolling through this program for quite some time. I think good coaches are going to stay at this program rather than go to what you would think would be an upgrade because of some of those coaches' salaries that they can hand out. So I think whether it's Rhett Lashley for the next 10 years or they bounce around to different coaches, there's going to be plenty of talent where they need to have it, which is in their backyard. Whether you want to go to DeSoto or you want to deal with some of the other high schools in Dallas, you're going to have plenty to play around with. You're going to have plenty of really big-time schools and plenty of awesome players to go out and pitch and say, you can literally go 5 minutes from your house and play big-time football and play elite football at the college football level. So that's a big-time thing for a lot of these kids. So it's going to be really interesting to watch them kind of go over the next 3, 5, 10 years, because right now they don't have anything coming in from the ACC, but they have plenty coming in from all other places, whether it's donors or, different sponsorship deals that can absolutely come up in the next little bit. There's definitely a lot of stones that they have not even overturned for the revenue route, and once they do, this is going to be a very dangerous entity. So it's one of those things that I think we just haven't been talking about quite enough. Obviously, going into 2024, I don't necessarily see SMU as a big-time contender in the ACC. I think they're a dangerous team, but not necessarily a team that I tend to believe is going to find their way to Charlotte. That doesn't mean they cannot be a big-time player in this conference going forward, and I tend to believe it's going to start in 2025 and not end for quite some time, because the money is not going to stop rolling in for quite some time, and as we've all kind of figured out over the last little bit, that tends to be the big-time moniker. So it's going to be really interesting to watch all of this kind of unfold, and I think when you look at SMU, they're not necessarily the craziest product to a lot of the younger kids in the college football world, but they're a big deal, and they're one of those that if you just hit the right buttons over the next couple of years on the football field, then everything off the football field is in really good shape to be just an absolute rocket ship that takes off. So I think this is a team and a conference in particular that they can attack, and they can absolutely be in the conversation for playoffs going forward, and maybe even in 2025. And if they're on a national stage and some of these Dallas kids can see a Dallas team playing in the playoff, there's going to be no question that recruiting is going to get a big-time boost, and then it's just off running. So I think SMU is one of those teams that right now going into 2024 might not be the most interesting story, but they're definitely really interesting going after 2024, and even going into 2024, they're plenty interesting. But it's definitely one of those things where it feels like a giant was just kind of wounded a little bit and definitely got knocked to the ground for quite some time, but 37 years later, they're back healthy, and they're coming for just about everything in college football, and they can compete more than some people are giving them credit for. But that'll be really interesting to watch. Let's take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to unpack the top contenders' seasons and where they'll be decided. There's about a 4-week stretch, 3-week stretch where a lot of teams' kind of seasons are decided, whether that's, they go the wrong direction in those, they go the right direction. It decides, are you a championship contender, are you not? And I'll break down the big 4 teams, Ohio State, Georgia, Texas, and Oregon, and we'll break down where I see those games coming for them in 2024. So stick with us, and we'll be right back with that.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different things around SMU and how they're a very dangerous team going into the next 5 or 10 years of college football, because they got plenty of money at their disposal. But it'll definitely be a very interesting thing to watch. But let's jump into segment 4 here, and let's get into the big time 4-week stretches for these contenders. Whether it's, 4 games that they absolutely have to win, 4 games that they got to split, 4 games that they got to go 3-1, whatever have you. You tend to find that in these championship runs, there's a week, 3-week, 4-week, 5-week, what have you. There's a stretch in that season where that team becomes a real-time championship contender. Whether it's, they went from a team that could be dangerous to a team that is really dangerous, or we're a team that we expected to be really good but just reaffirm that in dominating fashion. It's definitely a lot of things to unpack there, and I think it's one of those things that you start to see more and more as you watch more college football. But let's jump in and let's start with Ohio State. And I think it starts with Iowa coming to town on October 5th, and I think that's going to be absolutely huge for this program. That's a game where the last couple of years it really hasn't been an issue for Ohio State. The last, number of years it has not been an issue for Ohio State, but it shouldn't be an issue this year. But it's definitely one that if they walk in and don't necessarily roll and don't necessarily play the football that we're expecting of them, we can definitely give a little bit of a side eye and worry a little bit about this offense. I understand that Iowa's going to have a fantastic defense, but there should be at least ability to make some plays and win this game by 21, 24 points at least. So that's definitely kind of the start of this stretch. Then you got Oregon. You got a huge game on October 12th, which is the best week of football in the entire season. But at Oregon is going to be absolutely huge, and it's going to be one of those games where you figure out, are you the team that's going to be the team to beat in the Big Ten this upcoming year? I think it would be one of those where you can really send a message to Oregon and say, this is still our conference. We're still going to run things over here. Us and Michigan are still the teams to beat, and you're going to have to go through us if you want a title. And we'll get into Oregon and Michigan a little bit later, but this one's going to be a huge one just for perception of Ohio State. Going into Oregon and getting that win and saying, we're still the top dog around here, you're not able to just walk in and beat us right away, is going to be huge for this team going forward, and will be huge for how they're treated going forward. And then you have Nebraska on October 26th after a bye, and I think that one's really, really interesting. This is enough time for Nebraska to really get rolling offensively, and Dylan Raiola to maybe kick off some of the cobwebs of that freshman season, and maybe they'll be able to roll over them. And frankly, Jim Knowles has been really, really good at coaching those defenses. So a freshman looking, not too great against a big-time defense like that wouldn't be overly surprising to me by any means. But I do think this is a game where, kind of like that Iowa one, where if they run into issues with this team, if they allow some plays, if they allow some plays defensively or offensively, if they don't play to that level, then you definitely have some worries about Ohio State going into the backstretch of the season, and then they go to Penn State, and that's obviously a game where, again, they've absolutely controlled that one for the last little bit, but they definitely need to be ready to go on that Saturday, because I think there's a Penn State team, especially on that offensive side of the ball, that is going to really get rolling throughout the year. I think Andy Kotelnicki and Drew Aller is not necessarily going to work right away, but it's definitely one that absolutely will develop throughout the season and could cause you problems down the stretch. So I think this is a game where Ohio State should win it. Ohio State should absolutely walk in and win this game, but there's a lot of variables going into this one, and whenever you play Penn State, it's never going to be an easy one to win. So I think Ohio State's going into that game with a lot of confidence, but there's definitely going to be a little bit of worry. And obviously, this doesn't include the biggest game on the schedule, because that's Michigan, and that would dwarf all of these games by a million miles. But at the end of the day, you got to go 3-1 in this stretch. I understand that is a very lofty goal for this team, but when you have Michigan down the road, when you have the Big Ten title possibly and the playoff, you're going to have to give yourself as much wiggle room as possible. So I think 3-1 is absolutely what they should do, and anything below that could be a problem. And then 4-0 should be the expectation, because they've been talking about it at Big Ten Media Days, but this team has one thing on its mind, and it's a national title. And if you can't beat these 4 teams in front of you, then you got a problem going after a national title this year. But let's move on and let's get into Georgia. And I think it starts at Texas on October 19th. This is a huge game. Obviously, Texas, the close second to Bama, doesn't include the big-time game again for this team. But I think this is the stretch where we're really going to figure out a lot about this team, because this is a stretch that they just haven't really seen in past years. Going to Texas, having to play Florida, at Ole Miss, and then Tennessee. is not necessarily a stretch that Georgia fans have really had to worry about. Two of those teams have not been on the schedule very often over the last little bit. So I think that Texas game is one where it's kind of like that Ohio State-Oregon game, right? You have to be able to send the message and say, we're the top dog around here. You're not going to roll in and beat us, even if we are playing on your field. So that's going to be kind of a message-sending game for Georgia if they can pull that one off. I think that Florida game is really, really interesting. Obviously, Kirby has taken care of that one pretty much every single year since he's shown up, but this one's going to be really, really interesting because this is a team that could get things going throughout the year, or they could be falling on their face. So it could be that Georgia rolls into that game and should be winning by 28 points. It could be that they're going into a dogfight and just winning a game by 1 point would be good enough. So that'll be a really interesting game, and we really won't know the impact of it until it comes around, but definitely will be a huge one to watch. And then you have at Ole Miss on November 9th, and that's one that might just be the one of this upcoming season. I understand Bama has all of the attention and definitely should, but I think that Ole Miss game is where you can either have UGA, lose their grip on the SEC or absolutely ruin everyone else's hope and take over the SEC once again. So I think that could be the moment where they just might win the SEC that Saturday and totally move on from the rest of the league. And then you have Tennessee coming to Athens, and this one's going to have so much juice. I can't remember a game, a Georgia-Tennessee game in particular, that going into the year had as much energy as the one this year is going to have. And I know that 2022 game was crazy, but coming into the year, we didn't necessarily expect what Tennessee had in store for us. So definitely it's going to be a really interesting game, and I think it's going to be one of those that is going to be a battle from start to finish. Whether it's, UGA coming out on top by 7 or 14 or, suffocating them the way they did in 2022, I don't know. But at the end of the day, I think this could be a game between two top 10 teams in the country, and if it's that, then you're going to have one of the best atmospheres you've seen in quite some time. I can almost promise you that. But this is a stretch that, as we talked about, UGA just hasn't had to deal with in previous years, and if they can go undefeated here, then this team is going to be really hard to beat. I can just promise you that. And if they go 3-1 or maybe even 2-2 here, then it might be a little bit of worry about Georgia even making the playoff this upcoming year. But it'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. Let's move on to Texas here, and I don't include the Georgia game in this stretch, and I know that's a little bit crazy, but I just think the back end of this schedule is going to be huge for Texas. It's going to be the culmination of what could be a season, what could be a not so good season. That UGA and Michigan game are going to be huge to kind of decide how important these games are, obviously, but the Florida one kicking it off on November 9th is one that I think Texas just needs to roll in. You have a team rolling in that might be reeling at this point, might have a new coach at this point, possibly, hopefully not, in my opinion. But at the end of the day, that's definitely a real possibility. And if you have that, you have to roll in this game. You have to be able to assert your dominance over a team that could just be on really uneven footing at that point. So I think that's a game that they likely should take care of and really need to. And then they go to Arkansas, and that's one that's kind of a sore spot for a lot of Texas fans, because I think every single Texas fan remembers in 2021 when they went up to Fayetteville and everyone on the team just looked straight up intimidated. They looked like they couldn't handle the atmosphere that they were walking into, and they're not walking into just one Fayetteville this upcoming year. They're walking into about 8 of them. So they're going to have to deal with that pretty much every week, and we'll figure out early on how they can deal with those atmospheres. But overall, it's definitely going to be really interesting to kind of see how all of this unfolds, and definitely going to be interesting to see if there's a place where they can get tripped up, this might be the spot. And if it is, then Texas might not be the team that we expect them to be this upcoming year. And then you have Kentucky kind of in the Florida camp. I think this is a little bit more of a dangerous team, and one that at this point of the year could have things really rolling and could be a really dangerous team with Brock Vandagriff at quarterback. But overall, you really shouldn't be playing with your food in this game. I understand that Kentucky's a really, really good team, but if you're a Texas team that is rolling in, whether you have 2 losses or 1 loss rolling into this game, you got to be ready to roll, and you absolutely have to be able to win this game by, let's say, 10, 14 points. It doesn't necessarily have to be overly pretty, but you absolutely have to be able to take care of business. There's no two ways about that. And then at A&M. And frankly, it's the game of the season for Texas. I understand you have Michigan, you have OU, you have Georgia. I think this is the one that frankly, Texas fans want to win the most, and some of these players want to win the most, and obviously there will be different answers across that entire fan base, but I think this is one of those games that it's been building up for just so long, and you have to be able to walk into that atmosphere and handle it, and it's going to show, Fayetteville and, going into Ann Arbor and all of these other places that they have to go to throughout the year will show if they can kind of handle it, but this is going to be one that might just be on a totally different level, and it'll be really, really interesting to watch all of that. But I think if they have one loss rolling into this game, you got to go 4-0 or 3-1 in this stretch. If you have no losses, 3-1 or even 2-2 would do. But overall, I think if this is a Texas team that is going to be dangerous this upcoming year and they're going to be a national title contender, they should be going 4-0. I understand there is tough atmospheres in there. I understand there are teams that are a little bit more physical than they've had to deal with in the past. But overall, if this is going to be a national title contender, these are 4 games that they should win and just continue rolling into an SEC title game in their first year. So that'll be really interesting to watch. And then finally, the last team here is Oregon, and definitely one that is really interesting going into this year. You have at Michigan on November 2nd that I think is going to be fascinating to unpack, because that's another game where Michigan can send the message that, you're the new kid on the block. We're not going to let you come in and absolutely dominate us year one. And then on the other side, Oregon can come in and say, no, that's exactly what we're going to do. So it'll be really interesting to watch that kind of unfold from a physicality perspective and just from a energy perspective on the Oregon side of things. And then you go to you have Maryland come to you, This one will be really interesting. I think Mike Locksley is one of those guys that always has something up his sleeve, always has a game where he calls an absolute masterclass, and this could be that. I understand this is definitely one of the longer shots in this video, but overall, I definitely think this is one of those that could get really sketchy, and if it does, then Oregon could have some troubles going into the last couple of weeks of the season, because they go to Wisconsin right after that, and I think it's one of those games that is really fascinating for a number of reasons, because I think Wisconsin could be rolling by that point. I don't necessarily think it's going to be the prettiest season to start for Wisconsin, and in the big-time games, I don't necessarily think they're going to come out on top, including this one, but overall, they could be a more dangerous team right now than they are in September, and they are in October, so I think they have an ability to at least make this a dangerous game, and one that, if they're looking forward to that Washington game that I'll get to here in a second, you could get into a little bit of trouble, but you do have a bye before you get into that Washington game, and frankly, I think they want to win this one the most. I understand the Ohio State game, the Michigan game, but kind of in the same vein of Texas and A&M, well, a different kind of argument, but you have a team that beat you twice last year. You have a team that kept you out of the playoff. You have a team that kept you from doing all the things that you wanted to do a year ago, and you really want to beat them, and you expect to beat them this upcoming year with a lot of the changes at Washington, but I think that's one that if they finish an awesome year in the Big Ten and go to a Big Ten title while beating Washington in the process, I don't think you could write it better if you were an Oregon fan. So that's going to be really fascinating to watch, but overall, there always tends to be a stretch of 3-4 games where a team turns from a team that you think can win a title to a team that absolutely can, or a team that is the on-odds favorite to win a title. And it's really interesting to watch those unfold, but we'll absolutely unpack some more throughout the week here and definitely get into some more details around all the other contenders and where they could possibly become really dangerous in 2024. But let's take our final break here, and when we come back, we're going to get into hot takes for the contenders in the ACC this time around. We've gotten through the Big 12, which had about 1 million contenders, but the ACC is a little bit more straightforward, so we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just got into the big time stretches for the Big Four teams going into this year, Georgia, Ohio State, Texas, and Oregon, and kind of decided where their stretch is going to be, where they become a big time championship contender and don't just become a team that has championship aspirations but hasn't realized them yet. So definitely will be really interesting to watch that unfold, but let's get into the ACC here and give some hot takes for the conference contenders in that conference. Frankly, I think there's a number of conference contenders technically, but only about 6 teams that I would really give a genuine shot to win this conference this upcoming year. So I have 6 for you today, and we'll break down this, and I'll start with Florida State. And this is one that I've gone back and forth on probably a million times throughout this offseason. Florida State has been one of the more confusing teams in my trying to get ready for the season. I can't figure out how good Florida State is going to be this year, but I'm going to roll with Florida State's portal moves will just not be enough to win an ACC title. It might be enough to get there, but I don't think this team has the guys that are going to make the big-time plays that you saw in the past. So I've kind of unpacked this a little bit before, but my main worry is DJ. I don't think that necessarily he's going to make the championship quote-unquote plays that need to be made that Jordan Travis absolutely was capable of making. So I've said this kind of analogy, but I think in the past they've been able to get A-plus transfers. They've been able to get A transfers. I think this cycle they got B-plus, maybe B transfers. And they're not bad players by any means, and they have plenty of really, really fabulous players on this team. But at the end of the day, I don't think, Keon Coleman I don't think Malik Benson is Keon Coleman. I don't think Roydell Williams is Trey Benson. So it's kind of one of those battles back and forth where I don't really know how good this team is going to be. I don't really know how well these guys are going to fit together, and I think they have plenty of talent, but at the end of the day, someone has to make those big-time winning plays, and maybe it's Hakeem Williams on the outside. Maybe the defense is so good that they don't really have to worry about too much stuff offensively, but overall, I just don't necessarily see those big-time plays and those championship-level plays being made by the group that they brought in, and particularly at the quarterback position, because what Jordan Travis did was open up this offense to insane amounts because of his running ability. DJ brings that a little bit, but not nearly to the same level of Jordan Travis, and I think that was as big of a part of Florida State's success on offense as really anything last year. So I think that's the biggest worry that I have. So I think this is a remarkable team. I think they have so many things going in the right direction, and I think they brought in a lot of good players. I just don't think they're championship level good. So I think they're going to be on the other side of that ACC title game and not necessarily be on the winning side this time around. But it'll be very interesting to watch and are definitely one of those teams that are really hard to peg down going into this year. But let's move on to Clemson here, and I want to get in. Oh, excuse me. I apologize for that. I want to get into Bryant Wesco because I think this is going to be the leading receiver on this team this upcoming year. I understand that Clemson, has some experienced guys, Tyler Moore being the main among them, that I think can make some noise, but I think there's difference makers on this team at wide receiver, and they're both freshmen. I think it's Bryant Wesco and TJ Moore are just a cut above athletically of some of these other guys. Tyler Brown is kind of on that level as well, but overall, I think this is a group that absolutely can be really good, and I think it almost has to be led by the young guys if it's going to be that way, because they play at a different level than some of these other guys do. So it might take them a little bit of time to get going. It might not necessarily be the smoothest transition into things, especially playing Georgia that first week of the season, but overall, I think this is a team that is a little bit more dangerous than some people are giving him credit for, partly because not a lot of people like to give Dabo Swinney any credit, but that's beside the point. I do think this is a team that has a lot of ability on the outside, and I think Bryant Wesco is one of those guys that can really open up this offense, and although he's a freshman, can definitely be a big-time player, and they might just need him to be if they're going to make the noise that they want to make this upcoming season. So I really expect this guy to be the leading receiver on the team, and I expect him to be one of the better receivers we've seen come through Clemson in quite some time over the next couple of years. But let's move on to Miami here and break down Ruben Bain. I think he's going to lead the Power 4 in sacks. I think he is that good of a player. Obviously, there's usually a group of 5 guy that goes for like 16 and a half or something absolutely crazy, so I'm not necessarily ready to say he's going to lead FBS in sacks, but he might be close. I think when you look at this conference, there's not an offensive tackle that I can see at least that can really handle this guy for 4 quarters, that can absolutely match up with this guy without doubt going into this next little bit. So I think it'll be really, really interesting to watch. And I think when you look into all of the different things that can happen around this season, this is a really, really dangerous player and one of those guys that, yeah, he's on the defensive side of the ball, but he can turn over this entire conference. He's coming off a 7.5 sack year, and a year where he was a freshman, and a year where he faced some better offensive tackles, and in the year where he didn't have a guy across from him like Elijah Alston that's going to be scary for offensive tackles in his own right. So I think he's going to get more one-on-ones, and I don't think there's a one-on-one where he cannot win. So Ruben Bain is one of those players that I think is on that level of a James Pierce Jr., a Michael Williams, a Jack Sawyer. He's just a little bit younger. That's the only difference between those two guys, and I think he's someone that can be an elite pass rusher and against some O-lines that might not be, at the elite level that they need to be to contain a guy like that. So I think he's going to be an absolute game wrecker, and I think he's the most important player on this team that is not named Cam Ward. I feel pretty confident in that, and if he can, do this and lead the Power 4 in sacks, you might just find Miami in the playoff, and that will be just incredible to watch this guy go up against some of the SEC and Big Ten tackles that are definitely a little bit higher level, but it'll be fascinating to watch if he can still dominate those guys all the same. But let's move on to Virginia Tech here, and I think they're going to finish this regular season 10-2 or better. And then when I look at this season, this isn't that crazy of a take, frankly. There's that Miami and Clemson game. Other than that, they have every single game should be not necessarily easy to win, but they should be favored by maybe even double digits in most of these games. The two other games that I'm watching pretty closely are Rutgers and Georgia Tech, but at the end of the day, both of those games should be wins. Both of those games should not really be huge issues for Virginia Tech, and that opens up a very interesting door where they do have to go down to Miami, and say you lose that game. That's all well and good, but you walk into that Clemson game with one loss, or hypothetically, if you beat Miami, you walk in undefeated. That place is going to be on fire, and there's going to be ACC title implications. There are going to be college football playoff implications. You could even punch your ticket to the ACC title and maybe the playoff on that day if you were able to beat Clemson. So I think this is one of those teams and programs that has been sitting dormant just for a little bit here, but absolutely has a lot of big things going on in 2024 and can be one of those teams that can make some noise in this conference and win an ACC title and get into the playoff and maybe knock off some teams while they're there. But it all starts with the regular season, and frankly, I think they're going to have just a really, really remarkable one this upcoming year. So really awesome to watch that team, and just cannot wait to watch Kyron Drones go to work, that's for sure. And then we have Noah Rogers and North Carolina State, and that's a team that has been really, really interesting here, but I think Noah Rogers is going to lead this team in receptions, and this is a little bit of cheating, I'm not going to lie, because I would go with receiving yards, but Kevin Concepcion absolutely has like a 200-yard, 250-yard game in him this year, so I don't necessarily feel too good about that, so I don't necessarily want to say that. I think it's going to be one of those things where you now have a counterpunch. You now have a guy that you can't just worry about number 10 on the field. You got to find number 5 as well, and I think he's one of those guys that can be a third down option, can be that middle of the field option for Grayson McCall, where he's really succeeded in the past, and he's had really good players. And Grayson McCall as well goes to the tight end a ton. Justin Jolie coming over from UConn is going to be huge. Kind of that Isaiah Likely connection is what they're hoping for down there, and I think it'll be really interesting to watch, but Noah Rogers, to me, is one of the biggest pickups in the portal for really any team across the country this year, because I think it totally changes this offense's complexion. I think it makes them a lot more dangerous, makes them not as, gimmicky, not as, gadget play oriented with Kevin Concepcion. You have a real, complete receiver that absolutely can make every play. Kevin Concepcion is plenty complete, not to say he's not, but I definitely think it opens so many different doors and takes some of the attention off Concepcion, where you can use him in handoffs, you can use him in jet sweeps, end arounds, what have you, and be really, really dangerous with that guy on the edge. So I think he's someone that maybe won't have, big time chunk plays. Maybe he doesn't make that 50-yard catch down the field like Kevin Concepcion can make, but he's going to make maybe 5 catches to get them in position to make that play. Or he's going to make that 5-yard catch that you absolutely need on a third down. So I think he's one of those guys that has been at Ohio State, so he's been a little bit under the radar because so many good wide receivers just roll in and out of that place. But I think NC State is a fantastic place for him to just really open up his college football career and be a really dangerous player. So I think he's someone that I absolutely love going into the ACC, and he's someone that can really make this team an ACC contender and possibly even win the conference for them because of how dangerous he is and just because of how complete he makes this offense look. So I really like this player. I really like this team, and I think it's one of those that the passing attack used to always be Kevin Concepcion and then live with whatever else happens. That's not going to be the case this year. You're going to have a number of different targets, and I think Noah Rogers might just get the majority of those targets this upcoming year. So it'll be really interesting to watch all of those kind of unfold because the ACC is one of those conferences where I circle these 6 teams as the teams that really have a shot in this conference, but doesn't necessarily mean this is the end-all be-all. Oh, it's only 5 teams. Excuse me. The 5 teams that I really circle in this conference, but definitely some other teams that could make some noise and make me look a little bit goofy for not putting them in this segment. But at the end of the day, it'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.